somewhere the waters are drying up, somewhere there is incessant floods happening. We know India, Bangladesh, China have been, said by in a study that there will be huge floods. We can see these photographs from the floods in Bangladesh, in Srinagar, where the people are, their houses are being damaged, the factories are being closed up, people are not able to go to their workplaces. And what is the impact? If people are not going to workplace, the study estimates $96 billion of annual GDP exposed to river floods every year, where $14 billion just in India and $5.4 billion in Bangladesh. So where is this impact coming from, right? How will we measure this impact at the corporate level, at the macroeconomic level, is what we are going to discuss today. Going forward, even if someone of you living in Delhi knows that every year during November, December, the construction is banned, right? Because there is high, the air quality is very poor. And because of high levels of pollution, the construction industry is blamed for all the pollution that is happening in Delhi. And what it leads to? It leads to 1,300 approximately projects getting delayed. And you know that projects getting delayed is a financial impact not only on the builders, but also on the consumers who have paid for these projects, for the houses that they have booked, right? So these are few examples, that you can keep exploring to understand that how climate change is actually impacting the financial health of the country, of the people, and for us as well, right? Similarly, Bangalore floods, right? 25 crores of losses to the companies. So, and what we are seeing that these climate related impacts are only increasing over the years, right? This figure is also given in your chapter number 3, where it says that, the impacts of different disasters like wildfires, storms, freezes, droughts, floods, it is getting severe and severe by the years. And the cost is exceeding to $1 billion, right? So it is very important for us as a manager, as a vice president, as a marketing manager, as a finance manager, even as an HR manager, to understand that how climate change is going to impact my revenues, my cost, and my underlying profits, right? That is why we say we are not only talking about financial profits now, we are also talking about people and planet, right? So we already know that different sectors contribute differently to climate change, right? Where electricity, heat production contributes the maximum 25%, right? Transportation 14%, industry 21%, and agriculture and forestry 24%, right? Building 6%. Can anyone tell me that when we are looking at this graph, how can we relate this graph to the climate risk, either the physical or the transition risk? How these different sectors, yeah.
Because we can think of a company and how and then we can drill down what kind of physical or transition risks related to climate they can face.
Right. And how, if we talk about energy, how energy sector is transitioning.
Like
Yes.
utilities are the most contributing sector to the climate change because they emit more carbon emissions, and that's why their scope 1 is higher in comparison to their scope 2 and scope 3, and therefore this graph shows that electricity and heat production is more contributing to the climate change. That's what I think.
Yes, that's true. That's true at a very broader level, right?
I have a point to add.
Right.
Yeah, so even though those both points are very subjectively engraved, we need to understand how these interdependencies are. We cannot live without electricity and energy, and these things are very much important, and agriculture becomes a primary sector. So when you look at a country, we look at the dependency as a country, as people, as a society, we have on these aspects, correct? So when fundamentally our dependency is higher, and our dependence in the form of by which we do agriculture, or the heat production itself is not in a sustainable manner, the higher would be the contribution, correct? I think that is how
Yes.
the risk part falls into place.
Right. That's exactly right, right? What is the interdependence? And why we are talking about sector specific? Because each sector has a different kind of materiality, right? Like, what material factors would be impacting agriculture would be very different from the factors which are impacting electricity and heat production. But when I look at this graph, you also immediately have to understand that what would be the financial impact on all these sectors, right? In and financial impact in terms of both the physical and the transition. So we will see today some examples from electricity, from real estate, and see that how climate change is impacting the financial parameters of these different sectors. So, how businesses can balance the climate related risk and opportunities as well as the financial impacts. So, climate risk, you already know, are two types: physical risk, transition risk, right? And physical risk, can you tell me which is the risk out of these two, which is more prominent for firms in near future? Whether it is transition risk or physical risk?
Transition risk. Like for in the European context, like they are saying that all the coal plants would be should be shut down, and they
Yeah.
should more focus on the renewable energy. In that case, the transition risk is high for them. For India, it is somewhat time is there, because they are focusing on net zero by 2070. So
Yeah.
depending upon the country, the transition risk would be, or the physical risk would be there.
Right, that's so true, right? So transition risk, because all the governments have provided their national determined contribution, right? And they have become a signatory to Paris Agreement, right? So Paris Agreement says that we have to reduce our global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And when we are talking about that, we know from chapter number 1 and 2 that carbon emissions are the most contributor to the climate change. So the most important, risk which firms are facing mostly is the transition risk, right? But again, as we always have to keep into mind, materiality of the firm and the materiality for the, right? Because a country which is surrounded by coastal region, is in a coastal region, may have a more physical risk, right? It may not have power plants, but it may be surrounded by coastal region which have a higher probability of a high sea level rise and higher floods happening. So now, when we talk about climate risk, right, before I go ahead for chapter number 6, it's very important to look at this figure in chapter number 3.3, right? And I hope you all remember that when we are talking about climate risk, it's not just about the different factors contributing to the climate risk in terms of physical risk, may we say hazards, and drivers, we say in terms of transition risk, right? So, transition risk drivers. It is very important for a firm when it is trying to understand the financial impact of climate change risk, that what are the exposures of the firm to these kinds of risk, right? So a firm may be facing floods and cyclone because this factory is located in a coastal area. But it is important to understand that how many of the factories are located in a coastal area, right? How far it is from the actual sea, right? And how many of the facilities are there. Similarly, if we talk about the transition risk, right? Whether you have a steel plant and whether you are manufacturing steel using fossil fuel based combustion or renewable energy based combustion, right? So what is your exposure to the specific risk is very important for the firms to understand. And lastly, how vulnerable you are. Have you started to mitigate the risk? Are you adapting to the different kinds of physical risk and transition risk by transitioning your operations? Maybe having adaptive infrastructure in terms of flood pumps, flood walls, fire, alarms, fire breaks, so that even though the physical risk and transition risk are happening where your facilities are located, but your vulnerability may go down if you have adopted the specific measures to reduce these risks. So whenever we are looking at the financial risk, always very carefully look at what is the specific driver which is impacting the firm's financial parameters like revenue, cost. What is the exposure of each firm and how vulnerable the firm is, how resilient the firm is to these kinds of risk. So this, I think you have already seen. I'll not go through this. This is from chapter number 3 only. Just looking at this, graph from chapter number 3, because chapter number 3 and 6 are quite related. Just look at this graph, which it tells that how physical risk, right, from climate change is impacting the real estate industry and how the real estate industry is impacting the financial industries, right? So from the real economy to the financial economy, how the impact is creating. So the first box tells us, the sea level rises and the more frequent storms happening because of physical risk, right? And the coastal properties, the real estate is located in coastal region have a greater risk of flooding in the future. What will happen when floods occur? Your property will be damaged and it will lead to lower property values because you will have to have higher insurance, you will have to reconstruct your buildings, right? Your credit facilities ability would be impacted, your insurance would be impacted, your rents would be impacted. And what will happen when you'll not be able to pay back your EMIs, right? Or maybe put your properties on rent, you will not be able to repay your EMIs. What will lead to? It will lead to the impact on financial institutions such as banks, because banks gives you mortgages on your commercial and residential properties. So banks' balance sheet would be impacted because of the sea level rise. And when these loans or mortgages are combined at a market level, right? That is, the mortgage securitization, what will happen? Your whole financial market would be impacted. Like, for example, if you know about the global financial crisis which happened in 2008, right? Which actually happened because the real estate mortgages were securitized. Mortgage backed assets were issued by different financial institutions. So the study by Bernstein 2019 says that US properties exposed to the sea level rise sell for 7% less on an average. Whereas a study by Keenan and Brad 2020 says local lenders pass on proportionately more sea level rise risk to markets. And Ozard and Khan 2019 says catastrophes increases mortgages just below limit that are passed on. Right? So what happened? The mortgages which are securitized and the impact on the markets, on the financial market. So when we're talking about markets here, it's about financial market, right? Just keep that in mind. So it is transmissioning to the financial portfolios of banks and to the aggregate financial market. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think this should have included the insurance effect, right? I mean, sometimes insurers don't, they don't, either they don't cover the property in anticipation of
Yes.
such an event, or when they cover, they don't pay the premium, enough premium as such.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, that also. So maybe this example, we are only talking about mortgages or loans, but of course, insurance is a very important factor, which we'll talk. Yeah.
Sure, sure.
And similarly, if you look at this particular graph quickly, it's the same graph, but it is also telling you that when you are converting the climate risk into a financial risk, right? What kind of data is required? Because whenever we are talking about measuring risk, right, managing risk, I can manage something only if I can measure. So how do I measure climate risk? So looking again at from the left hand side, when I talk about sea level rise, I need data related to weather. I need climate modeling, right? Where I can analyze the physical impact of the weather, the projections of floods in the future, right? Then I would also need to know what is an exposure, right? Exposure. Look at the blue. So I'll just see. So green one will tell me the hazards. Blue boxes are telling me the exposure and the vulnerability of the different firms, right? Do I have, what is the geographic location of my factory in that particular area? Because, when we're talking about weather related data, right? The data which is available in, globally, maybe at a very country level, right? But I need to go in a very granularity and see that what kind of topological, conditions that particular uh, state has. Like we say, Mumbai is more prone to, go into the water. But do we talk that much about Goa or Kerala or other coastal areas? So topological maps is important. Data on flood defenses. Similarly, how vulnerable am I? Have I installed flood gates so that my factory, even though being located in a coastal area, it does not gets impacted when there is a flood, right? So exposure and vulnerability is important because that will define how much my property values goes down. And when I talk about banks or markets, I need to know what is the cross correlation in a portfolio. Like if I talk about a bank like State Bank of India would provide loans to different sectors. So what is the proportion of the loan in my total loan portfolio that has been given to a industry or to a firm which is having the factories installed in coastal areas? So what is the relationship of that exposure in my overall portfolio is very important. Similarly, what is the duration of exposure? How many long-term loans do I have? How many short-term loans do I have? Right? At the bank level, the bank will analyze. And at the market level, it will analyze that what is the distribution of the risk. What are the disclosures which are made by different firms, right? Different real estate firms, different financial institutions. And do I have the access to the granular financial and climate risk data or not? Yes, someone has just raised hands.
Hi, I have a doubt here. When this particular calculation is centered in positioning from a company perspective, correct? Like what is going to impact to me as a firm on how in different way to understand how the business, the finances, the loans, and all of that in a larger level gets affected to me as a firm. Okay. Now, when you're thinking from a bank perspective, regulatory perspective, or even a legal perspective, just like the case studies you discussed before, right? If I have already, I'm a very rich company, and I have the assets, and I have accumulated cheap land in a coastal area, which had, risk problems, but then it was cheaper, so I did not take that into account, right? And I started exploiting the environment further, like from the because I was pretty much having a rough idea, but I didn't know a larger impact. But I started exploiting it further. Correct. So the very existence of my activity, economic activity to that particular geography land is actually worsening this situation and impacting the immediate environment and in indirectly it is connecting back to me, right, as a firm.
Mhm.
So how is the other side of this getting captured? Is it that where the ESG scoring, comes where, I mean, the materiality scoring? I mean, this part is mostly like the risk calculation side. So where is that data getting interlinked?
Reflected where? In the investors' portfolio or in the
Yeah.
firm's portfolio?
I mean, see, I don't think the firm on that level might not be very, enthusiastic to know, because as far as their finances, or I mean, they're getting the returns, right? But they'll only get to know this when the regulatory or the legal part of calculating the ESG risk of that particular firm, that's when it gets calculated, correct? How much environmental damage they're creating as a firm. Because of which,
So
yeah.
what I'd like to say at this point, because a lot of point relating to your question we'll be discussing in the next slides. What I would like to say here is that now when climate change, has been identified as the second global risk, by World Economic Forum, that climate risk is going to impact all the firms. Now firms themselves have started to analyze these risks. Right. And if you look at the different regulatory requirements which are coming up in US or Europe, and even in India, if you talk about PRSR reports, we ourselves have to disclose our risk. And that is where the last topic, which talks about enterprise risk management, actually talks about that how firms are including the climate risk in their traditional risk assessment. So now if a firm, as we saw in the case of Volkswagen or Coca-Cola, that if the firms are not waking up to the risk to which they are vulnerable, then they are themselves suffering financial loss. And that is the whole aim of this chapter, to understand that how firms are being impacted by the climate change. Okay. So we will, go through this slides, and then, we can come back to the question that you want to ask, right? So how it is transmitting to the banks and to the market.